Hello and welcome to Night Historian. I am grateful you have chosen to spend this hour in darkness, away from the noise of the world. Before we begin, I ask only this. If you find value in what unfolds, consider supporting this work through a like or subscription. Your engagement sustains these stories. I am also curious, where do you listen and at what hour? The comments section remains open to you. Now, dim the lights, let the outside world recede. Let us begin. We turn our attention tonight to a question that has occupied historians for centuries. Why does one city master an entire sea, while another, equally gifted, equally positioned, gradually surrenders to irrelevance? This is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of two merchant republics, Venice and Genoa, whose 300-year struggle for Mediterranean dominance reveals something fundamental about power itself. Their conflict was not merely military. It was economic, political, cultural. It was a battle between two fundamentally different visions of how a civilization should organize itself, how it should make decisions, how it should survive. The answer lies not in the ships they built or the battles they fought, but in the systems they chose to create. The Mediterranean, in the 9th century, was not a unified space but a fractured one. Where Rome had once imposed order, Byzantine emperors now held fragmented territories along distant coasts. The sea itself remained treacherous, infested with pirates, dominated by Arab fleets, hostile to those who lacked superior knowledge of wind and current. Into this chaos emerged two cities, neither of which possessed obvious advantages over the other. Venice occupied a peculiar geography. Built upon lagoon islands in the northern Adriatic, the city existed in constant negotiation with water. Merchants there could not expand inland. The marshes prevented it. Instead, they looked outward, toward the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world beyond. This isolation, which might have crippled a terrestrial power, became Venice's greatest asset. The lagoons offered natural protection. Enemies could not easily assault a city built on islands. More importantly, the Venetians developed an intimate knowledge of maritime trade that their competitors lacked. They understood currents, tides, seasonal winds. They built ships suited to shallow waters and open seas alike. Genoa, by contrast, occupied the Ligurian coast to the west. The city sat at the intersection of Mediterranean and Alpine trade routes. Mountains rose behind it, connecting to the wealthy territories of northern Italy and beyond. Genoese merchants could trade overland as easily as by sea. This dual access to both maritime and terrestrial commerce seemed advantageous, yet it also created a fundamental difference in how the city organized itself. Genoa's power derived partly from the sea, but also from its connections to inland nobility and merchant families with territorial holdings. Venice had no such option. The city was purely maritime. The Crusades transformed both cities. Beginning in the late 11th century, Christian armies mobilized to reclaim the Holy Land. Venice and Genoa recognized opportunity immediately. These military expeditions required transport. Crusaders needed ships to reach distant shores. Both cities competed fiercely to provide vessels, supplies, and passage. In return, they gained trading privileges in conquered territories. Venice secured favourable positions in ports throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Genoa obtained similar concessions, though often in different locations. The Crusades were not merely religious campaigns, they were commercial ventures disguised in religious language. Yet the Crusades also revealed something deeper about each city's character. Venetian merchants approached the Holy Wars as a systematic enterprise. The Republic organized fleets, negotiated contracts, managed logistics. Individual merchants operated within a framework established by the state. Genoese merchants, by contrast, pursued opportunities more independently. Wealthy families outfitted their own ships, negotiated their own agreements with crusading armies. The state provided some coordination, but individual ambition drove much of the activity. Lesser known to modern observers is Venice's early involvement in the slave trade. Venetian merchants purchased enslaved people from the Dalmatian coast and sold them throughout the Mediterranean. This trade generated substantial wealth. It also established networks of commerce that extended far beyond the Holy Wars. Genoa pursued similar ventures, though with less systematic organization. Both cities understood that profit could be extracted from human suffering. Both cities accepted this as the ordinary cost of commerce. Genoa's early dominance in Corsica and Sardinia provided a different foundation for power. These islands offered strategic positions, controlling Western Mediterranean routes. Genoese families established themselves as rulers and merchants simultaneously. They collected taxes, maintained fortifications, and conducted trade from positions of territorial authority. Venice never pursued this model. The Republic focused instead on maritime trade without territorial conquest in the Western Mediterranean. This difference would prove significant across the centuries. By the year 1000, both cities had emerged as major Mediterranean powers. Neither dominated completely. The Byzantine Empire remained formidable. Arab and later Turkish fleets controlled significant portions of the sea. Yet Venice and Genoa possessed advantages their rivals lacked. They built superior ships. They developed sophisticated trading networks. They organized their merchant classes more effectively than competitors. Most importantly, both cities recognized that the Mediterranean was not merely a highway for trade, but a contested space where military power and commercial advantage intertwined inseparably. The sea itself remained dangerous. Storms could destroy entire fleets. Pirates preyed on merchant vessels. Disease ravaged crews confined to ships for weeks at a time. Yet the rewards justified the risks. A single successful voyage could generate profits that sustained a merchant family for years. The spice trade in particular offered extraordinary returns. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and other exotic goods commanded prices in European markets that bore no relationship to their cost in the East. Merchants who could secure reliable supplies of these commodities accumulated wealth rapidly. Both Venice and Genoa understood this calculus. Both cities organized themselves around maritime commerce. Both developed the institutional structures necessary to manage complex trading operations across vast distances. Yet they made different choices about how to organize power, how to make decisions, how to balance individual ambition against collective interest. These choices, made in the early medieval period, would echo through 3 centuries of conflict. By 1300, the question had become unavoidable. Could the Mediterranean sustain 2 rival maritime powers indefinitely, or would one eventually dominate the other completely? The answer would determine not merely the fate of 2 cities, but the shape of Mediterranean civilization itself. The governance structures of Venice and Genoa diverged fundamentally during the medieval period, creating 2 distinct models of political organization. This divergence would prove more consequential than any single military victory or commercial triumph. The systems themselves determined how each city responded to crisis, adapted to change, and made decisions under pressure. Venice constructed what historians call the Great Council, or Maggior Concilio. This body consisted of merchant families whose names appeared in official registers. Membership was hereditary, but not absolute. Families could lose status through bankruptcy or disgrace. The Great Council functioned as a deliberative assembly where major decisions required consensus or near consensus. A merchant proposing a new trading venture, a military expedition, or a diplomatic initiative had to convince other council members of its merit. This process moved slowly. Debates extended across multiple sessions. Compromises emerged through negotiation rather than decree. The Doge of Venice served as chief executive, but his powers remained circumscribed. He could not declare war without council approval. He could not negotiate treaties independently. He could not levy taxes arbitrarily. The position carried prestige and influence, yet the Doge functioned within constraints that prevented any individual from accumulating excessive authority. This system reflected Venice's fundamental anxiety about tyranny. The Republic had experienced periods of factional violence. Powerful individuals had threatened to dominate the state. The Great Council represented an institutional response to these dangers. Genoa organized itself differently. Rather than hereditary merchant oligarchy, Genoa employed the podesta system. A foreign administrator, typically a nobleman from another Italian city, served as chief magistrate for a fixed term, usually 2 years. This outsider was supposed to govern impartially, above local factional conflicts. In theory, the podesta prevented any single Genoese family from dominating the state. In practice, the system created chronic instability. Powerful families competed for influence over the podesta. When one family's candidate assumed office, rival families felt threatened. When the podesta's term ended, his successor often reversed his policies. Continuity proved elusive. Genoa's internal structure reflected its geography and history. The city contained multiple powerful merchant families with territorial holdings in the surrounding region. These families maintained private armies, controlled fortifications, and conducted independent foreign policies. The state existed partly to coordinate these powerful actors, but it never fully subordinated them to collective authority. Individual family interest often trumped communal benefit. A decision that favored one family's trading routes might damage another family's interests. Consensus rarely emerged. Venice imposed strict regulations against corruption. Officials who enriched themselves through their positions faced severe penalties. Confiscation of property, exile, even execution awaited those caught diverting public funds. These laws were enforced with remarkable consistency. Merchants understood that the system's legitimacy depended on its perceived fairness. If officials could steal with impunity, the entire structure would collapse. Venice maintained this discipline across centuries. Genoa accepted a different standard. Powerful families expected to benefit from their members' positions in government. A Doria or Spinola, serving as admiral, could direct military resources toward family interests. A Fieschi, in a position of authority, could advance family trading privileges. This was not considered corruption, but rather the natural order of things. Family loyalty superseded loyalty to the state. A man's primary obligation was to his relatives, not to abstract principles of public good. The requirement that wealthy Venetian merchants serve in government created a different incentive structure. A merchant who spent years managing state affairs developed investment in the Republic's success. His wealth depended on Venice's prosperity. His children would inherit positions within the system. This alignment of personal interest and public welfare encouraged merchants to think beyond their immediate advantage. Genoa's system created opposite incentives. A merchant family could grow wealthy through private ventures while remaining largely indifferent to state affairs. Why invest energy in collective governance when individual enterprise offered greater rewards? Historians continue to debate whether Venice's system was genuinely more democratic or simply more effective at creating the appearance of unity. The Great Council excluded the vast majority of Venice's population. Ordinary labourers, artisans, and the poor had no voice in governance. Yet within the merchant elite, participation was broader than in Genoa. Decisions emerged through discussion rather than decree. This created a sense of shared responsibility among those who held power. The fundamental difference lay in how each city conceived of power itself. Venice built a machine designed to perpetuate itself. The system transcended any individual. The Doge served the Republic did not serve the Doge. Merchant families participated in governance, but the institution remained primary. Decisions reflected collective judgment rather than individual will. This created stability. It also created rigidity. The system resisted rapid change. Innovation required consensus, which took time to achieve. Genoa built something closer to a collection of ambitious men held together by temporary agreements. Power flowed from family strength and individual capability. The state provided a framework for competition, but it did not truly subordinate powerful actors to collective authority. This created flexibility. Decisions could be made quickly when one family achieved dominance. It also created instability. When power shifted from one family to another, policies reversed. Continuity proved difficult to maintain. These architectural differences would shape how each city responded to the challenges ahead. When crisis emerged, Venice's institutional strength would allow coordinated response. Genoa's factional structure would fragment under pressure. When opportunity appeared, Venice's consensus building would move slowly, potentially missing advantages. Genoa's flexibility would allow rapid exploitation of opportunities, but without sustained coordination. Neither system was inherently superior. Each possessed strengths and weaknesses. Yet in the long struggle for Mediterranean dominance, these structural differences would prove decisive. The ships that carried Venetian and Genoese merchants across the Mediterranean reflected fundamentally different approaches to naval design. Venice favoured the galley, a long narrow vessel propelled by oars and supplemented by sails. The galley offered manoeuvrability in calm waters and reliability when winds failed. It could navigate shallow harbours and coastal routes where larger vessels could not venture. Genoa preferred the cog and later the carrack, broader vessels with deeper drafts designed for open ocean voyages. These ships carried more cargo relative to their crew size. They could withstand rougher seas, yet they required deeper harbours and proved less agile in confined waters. This difference in ship design reflected each city's geography and trading priorities. Venice's routes extended through the Adriatic and into the Byzantine-controlled eastern Mediterranean. These waters contain numerous islands, shallow passages, and confined harbours. The galley's manoeuvrability suited this environment perfectly. Genoa's merchants ranged more widely across the open Mediterranean. They travelled to North Africa, to Spain, to the Atlantic coast. The cog's capacity and seaworthiness made it superior for these longer voyages. The Venetian arsenal represented an unprecedented innovation in maritime production. This facility, established in the 12th century, functioned as a massive shipyard where the state controlled every aspect of ship construction. Workers operated in specialized sections, each responsible for a particular component. One section built hulls, another constructed masts, a third manufactured rigging. This division of labour allowed standardization. Every Venetian galley conformed to established specifications. Replacement parts were interchangeable. Repairs could be completed quickly because components fit together predictably. The arsenal also pioneered mass production techniques centuries before industrial manufacturing became common. The state owned the facility and controlled the workforce. Skilled craftsmen received regular wages rather than payment per vessel. This arrangement allowed the state to maintain a permanent labour force capable of rapid expansion when military needs demanded it. During wartime, the arsenal could produce multiple ships simultaneously. During peacetime, it maintained a smaller workforce sufficient for merchant vessel construction and maintenance. Genoa's shipyards operated on a different principle entirely. Multiple family-owned facilities scattered throughout the city competed with one another. Each yard maintained its own workforce and techniques. There was no standardization across different yards. A ship built by the Spinola family differed in significant ways from one constructed by the Doria family. This lack of uniformity reflected Genoa's decentralized political structure. No central authority could impose standardization on independent merchant families. The consequences of these different approaches became apparent during military conflicts. Venice could rapidly concentrate naval force because its ships were interchangeable. Damaged vessels could be repaired using standardized parts. Crews trained on one galley could operate any other Venetian galley without significant adjustment. Genoa's fleets, by contrast, contained vessels of varying designs. Each ship required specialized knowledge to operate effectively. Crews trained on one type of cog might struggle with another design. Repairs took longer because replacement components were not standardized. Navigation techniques differed between the two cities, though both developed sophisticated methods. Venetian pilots maintained written charts and records of routes, currents, and hazards. These documents were carefully preserved and passed between generations. A pilot could consult written records of previous voyages to understand what conditions to expect at particular seasons. This systematic approach to navigation knowledge represented a precursor to modern navigation science. Information was recorded, organized, and transmitted through institutional channels. Genoese pilots relied more heavily on oral tradition and individual expertise. A master pilot accumulated knowledge through decades of personal experience. He understood the sea through intimate familiarity rather than through written records. When a Genoese pilot trained younger men, he transmitted knowledge directly through demonstration and instruction. This approach produced pilots of extraordinary skill, yet it created vulnerability. If a master pilot died unexpectedly, his knowledge died with him. The city lost accumulated expertise that could not be easily replaced. The compass represented a significant navigational innovation that both cities adopted, yet they integrated it differently into their systems. Venetian authorities incorporated compass use into standardized training programs. Young pilots learned compass navigation as part of a formal curriculum. The skill became institutionalized. Genoese pilots also mastered compass navigation, but training remained informal. Individual masters taught apprentices according to their own methods. Standardization never emerged. Sailor culture differed markedly between the two cities. Venice maintained a professional navy consisting of men who served the state continuously. These sailors received regular wages and benefits. They trained systematically in naval tactics and ship handling. They understood themselves as servants of the Republic. Genoa relied more heavily on mercenary fleets. Wealthy families hired professional commanders and crews for specific campaigns. These men fought for pay rather than patriotic commitment. When a campaign ended, they dispersed, seeking employment elsewhere. The professional Venetian navy created institutional memory. Tactics developed in one campaign were preserved and refined for subsequent conflicts. Commanders studied previous battles to understand what strategies succeeded and which failed. The navy functioned as a learning organization that accumulated knowledge across generations. Genoese mercenary forces lacked this institutional continuity. Each commander brought his own methods and approaches. Knowledge accumulated in one campaign might be lost when that commander moved to employment elsewhere. Training systems reflected these differences in organization. Venice established formal schools where young men learned navigation, ship handling, and naval tactics. These institutions transmitted knowledge systematically. Genoa relied on apprenticeship. Young men learned by working alongside experienced sailors and pilots. This method produced skilled individuals, but did not create institutional knowledge bases. By the 13th century, it had become clear that mastery of the sea required more than superior ships or individual courage. It demanded systems. Venice understood this principle and built accordingly. The arsenal, the standardized designs, the formal training programs, the written navigation records. These represented a comprehensive system for maritime dominance. Genoa possessed excellent sailors and capable commanders, yet lacked the institutional framework that transformed individual excellence into sustained superiority. This difference would become increasingly consequential as the two cities competed for control of Mediterranean trade routes. The Crusades transformed Mediterranean commerce into a contested battlefield. Beginning in 1096, Christian armies mobilized to reclaim the Holy Land from Islamic control. Venice and Genoa recognized immediately that these military campaigns created unprecedented commercial opportunities. Crusaders required transport across the sea. They needed supplies, provisions, and weapons. Both cities competed fiercely to monopolize this lucrative trade. Venice secured a dominant position in crusading logistics. The Republic negotiated contracts with crusading armies, agreeing to transport knights, soldiers, and supplies to the Levant. In exchange, Venice received trading privileges in ports that Crusaders conquered. When Crusaders captured Acre in 1104, Venice obtained favourable commercial terms. Venetian merchants established warehouses and trading posts throughout the city. They gained access to spice markets and luxury goods flowing from the east. This commercial foothold proved extraordinarily profitable. Genoa pursued similar opportunities but with less systematic coordination. Genoese merchant families outfitted their own ships and negotiated individual agreements with crusading forces. Some families prospered enormously, others invested in ventures that failed to generate expected returns. The decentralized approach allowed flexibility but prevented the kind of sustained dominance that Venice achieved through coordinated state action. Competition between the two cities intensified as crusading campaigns continued across the 12th and 13th centuries. Both Venice and Genoa sought to control the most profitable routes and the most valuable trading posts. Smaller conflicts erupted periodically. Venetian and Genoese fleets clashed in various Mediterranean locations. These early skirmishes remained limited in scale, but they revealed the fundamental antagonism between the two powers. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 represented a turning point. Crusaders assembled in Venice to embark for the Holy Land. Yet the campaign took an unexpected direction. Rather than sailing to the Levant, the crusading army attacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Venice played a crucial role in this diversion. Venetian leaders recognized that Constantinople controlled immensely valuable trade routes. They convinced the Crusaders to attack the city rather than proceed to the Holy Land. The assault succeeded. Constantinople fell to Crusader forces. This moment transformed Mediterranean power dynamics. Venice secured enormous territorial gains. The Republic obtained control over numerous Byzantine islands and coastal territories. Venetian merchants established trading posts throughout the former Byzantine Empire. The city's commercial network expanded dramatically. Venice now dominated routes to the Black Sea, the Levant, and Egypt. The spice trade, which generated extraordinary profits, fell largely under Venetian control. Genoa watched these developments with deep resentment. The Republic had not participated in the Fourth Crusade. Genoese merchants were excluded from the most valuable trading posts that Venice secured. This exclusion proved consequential. Venice's monopoly on Byzantine trade generated wealth that Genoa could not match through other ventures. The Fourth Crusade represented not merely a military victory, but a fundamental shift in commercial advantage. Venice emerged as the Mediterranean's dominant maritime power. Genoa responded by developing alternative trade routes. Rather than competing with Venice in the eastern Mediterranean, Genoese merchants focused on the Black Sea trade. They established trading posts at Caffa and Tanna on the northern Black Sea coast. These locations provided access to goods flowing from Central Asia and the Far East. Genoese merchants developed networks extending into the Caucasus and beyond. This trade proved profitable, yet it never generated the consistent wealth that Venice extracted from its Mediterranean monopoly. The loss of Acre in 1291 marked another crucial moment. Crusader forces lost their final major stronghold in the Holy Land. Both Venice and Genoa lost access to the profitable crusading trade. Yet the consequences differed for each city. Venice possessed sufficient territorial holdings and trading posts throughout the eastern Mediterranean to maintain commercial dominance. The city's wealth did not depend entirely on crusading logistics. Genoa, by contrast, had invested more heavily in crusading trade. The loss of Acre damaged Genoese commerce more severely. Smaller naval conflicts erupted with increasing frequency during the late 13th century. Venetian and Genoese fleets clashed in the Adriatic, the Aegean, and off the coasts of North Africa. These encounters remained limited in scale, yet they established a pattern of antagonism. Both cities understood that they competed for the same resources. Both recognized that the Mediterranean could not indefinitely sustain two rival maritime powers of equal strength. The fundamental difference between the two cities became increasingly apparent during this period. Venice approached Mediterranean commerce as a systematic enterprise. The state negotiated treaties, established trading posts, and maintained military forces to protect commercial interests. Individual merchants operated within frameworks established by the Republic. Genoa's merchants pursued opportunities more independently. Wealthy families conducted their own negotiations, established their own trading posts, and maintained their own military forces. The state coordinated these activities but did not fully control them. This difference shaped how each city responded to changing circumstances. When Venice faced obstacles, the Republic mobilized collective resources to overcome them. When Genoa faced similar obstacles, individual families pursued separate solutions. Venice's approach created sustained advantage. Genoa's approach created flexibility, but prevented the kind of coordinated dominance that Venice achieved. By 1300, both cities recognized that the era of coexistence was ending. The Mediterranean contained sufficient wealth to support both, yet not enough to allow both cities to dominate simultaneously. One would eventually subordinate the other. The question was not whether conflict would intensify, but when and under what circumstances. The early skirmishes and commercial rivalries of the crusading era had established the fundamental antagonism. The next 3 centuries would determine which city ultimately prevailed. Venice constructed a trading system based on state monopoly and centralized control. The Republic designated specific merchants as official traders for particular routes and commodities. A merchant family granted the monopoly on pepper trade could purchase spices from Eastern suppliers and sell them throughout European markets. No competitor could legally undercut their prices or access their supply chains. This monopoly system generated enormous profits for the favoured merchants and substantial tax revenue for the state. The Venetian model required extensive bureaucratic infrastructure. Officials tracked which merchants held which monopolies. Inspectors verified that merchants complied with state regulations. Customs agents collected taxes on goods entering and leaving the city. This administrative apparatus consumed resources, yet it created predictability. Merchants knew exactly what regulations governed their activities. The state enforced these regulations consistently. This consistency attracted merchants from throughout Europe, who valued the security of operating within established legal frameworks. Genoa pursued a fundamentally different approach. The Republic did not grant monopolies to individual merchants. Instead, it allowed multiple families to compete for the same trade routes and commodities. A Genoese merchant could trade in pepper, spices, or any other commodity without requiring state permission. Competition determined prices rather than monopoly arrangements. This system created lower barriers to entry. Ambitious merchants with modest capital could participate in trade without securing state approval. The consequences of these different models became apparent across the 14th century. Venice's monopoly system generated steady, predictable profits. Merchants knew their returns in advance. They could plan long-term investments with confidence. The state collected consistent tax revenue. This allowed Venice to maintain military forces, construct public works, and invest in infrastructure. The system proved stable and sustainable. Genoa's competitive model created higher volatility. Prices fluctuated as merchants competed aggressively. Profits could be extraordinary during favorable market conditions, yet merchants faced ruinous losses when competition intensified. This volatility discouraged long-term planning. Merchants pursued immediate gains rather than sustained strategies. The state collected less tax revenue because merchants could minimize their obligations through various accounting techniques. Venice's Stato di Mare represented an ambitious territorial expansion. The Republic acquired islands and coastal territories throughout the eastern Mediterranean. These possessions served as trading posts, military bases, and sources of agricultural products. Venice controlled Crete, Cyprus, and numerous smaller islands. The Republic maintained garrisons in these locations and appointed governors to administer them. This territorial empire required military expenditure to defend, yet it generated substantial commercial returns. Genoa's approach differed markedly. The Republic established trading posts in numerous locations but rarely acquired territorial control. Genoese merchants operated in ports controlled by other powers. They negotiated commercial privileges with local rulers, but did not attempt to govern territories directly. This lighter footprint reduced military expenditure. It also limited Genoa's ability to enforce monopolies or prevent competitors from accessing the same markets. Venice pioneered sophisticated accounting techniques that allowed merchants to track complex transactions across multiple voyages and years. Double-entry bookkeeping, developed by Venetian merchants, created systematic records of debits and credits. This innovation allowed merchants to calculate precise profit margins and identify inefficiencies in their operations. It also allowed the state to verify merchant claims about their income and assess taxes accurately. This accounting revolution represented a crucial advantage. Merchants who understood their finances precisely could make better decisions than those relying on rough estimates. Genoa's merchant families developed different financial innovations. Genoese bankers pioneered the Bill of Exchange, a document allowing merchants to transfer funds across distances without physically transporting gold or silver. A merchant in Venice could purchase a bill of exchange from a Genoese banker, travel to the Levant, and exchange it for local currency. This innovation reduced the risk of robbery and simplified long-distance commerce. Yet bills of exchange represented a financial instrument rather than an accounting system. They did not provide the comprehensive financial visibility that double-entry bookkeeping offered. The spice trade illustrates the consequences of these different economic models. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and other exotic spices commanded extraordinary prices in European markets. A merchant who could secure reliable supplies could generate profits exceeding 500% on individual transactions. Venice's monopoly system allowed the state to control spice supplies carefully. Officials limited the quantity of spices available to European markets, maintaining high prices. Venetian merchants who held the monopoly prospered enormously. Competitors could not access supplies at any price. Genoa's merchants competed fiercely for spice supplies. Multiple families pursued the same trade routes. Prices fell as competition intensified. Genoese merchants earned lower profit margins than their Venetian counterparts, yet they developed alternative strategies. Some families focused on volume, trading large quantities at lower margins. Others specialized in particular spices or particular markets. This diversity created resilience. When one trade route became unprofitable, merchants could shift to other opportunities. Risk tolerance differed fundamentally between the two cities. Venice's monopoly system discouraged risk-taking. A merchant granted a monopoly on pepper trade had no incentive to explore new routes or new commodities. The existing arrangement generated sufficient profits. Innovation might disrupt the monopoly system, creating uncertainty. Merchants preferred stability to experimentation. Genoa's competitive system encouraged risk-taking. A merchant who discovered a new trade route or a new commodity could potentially monopolize it temporarily before competitors learned of the opportunity. First-mover advantage could generate extraordinary profits. This created incentives for exploration and experimentation. Genoese merchants pursued ventures that Venetian merchants would consider excessively risky. These different philosophies shaped how each city approached long-term economic strategy. Venice built for permanence. The monopoly system, the territorial empire, the administrative infrastructure. These represented investments in sustained dominance. Venice accepted lower profit margins in exchange for stability and predictability. The city's wealth grew steadily across decades. Genoa built for dominance. The competitive system, the financial innovations, the risk-taking, these represented strategies for rapid wealth accumulation. Genoa accepted instability in exchange for the possibility of extraordinary profits. The city's wealth fluctuated more dramatically than Venice's, yet occasionally exceeded it during favourable periods. By the mid-14th century, it had become clear that these two economic models could not coexist indefinitely. Venice's monopoly system required the ability to exclude competitors. Genoa's competitive system required access to the same markets and trade routes. As both cities expanded their commercial operations, they increasingly competed for the same resources. The question was not whether conflict would emerge, but whether Venice's institutional stability would prove superior to Genoa's competitive dynamism. Venice's diplomatic strategy reflected pragmatism above ideology. The Republic maintained alliances with the Byzantine Empire, securing access to eastern trade routes and military support against common enemies. When the Ottoman Empire emerged as a rising power in the 14th century, Venice negotiated treaties with Ottoman rulers despite their Islamic faith. These agreements allowed Venetian merchants to operate in Ottoman-controlled ports. The Republic accepted Ottoman sovereignty over territories it could not defend militarily. This pragmatic approach generated criticism from other Christian powers, yet it preserved Venetian commercial interests. Genoa pursued different alliances shaped by its decentralized structure. The Republic aligned with the Holy Roman Empire, seeking support against rivals in northern Italy. Genoese families maintained connections with various Italian city-states, creating networks of mutual obligation. These alliances proved less stable than Venice's arrangements. When political circumstances shifted, Genoese alliances often collapsed. A family that supported one power might switch allegiance when a rival family gained influence in government. The Genoese-Venetian War of 1257 to 1270 represented the first major direct conflict between the two cities. The war erupted over competition for Byzantine trade routes and territorial possessions. Both cities mobilized their merchant fleets for military purposes. Battles occurred in the Aegean Sea and the eastern Mediterranean. Neither side achieved decisive victory. The conflict exhausted both cities' resources without resolving the underlying antagonism. This war revealed crucial differences in how each city mobilized for conflict. Venice coordinated military operations through state institutions. The Republic commissioned ships, appointed commanders, and directed strategy from a central authority. Genoese military forces operated more independently. Individual families contributed ships and men according to their own calculations of advantage. Coordination proved difficult. Some families invested heavily in the war effort, while others held back, waiting to see which side would prevail before committing resources. The war's conclusion through negotiation rather than victory illustrated both cities' limitations. Neither possessed sufficient military power to eliminate the other. Both recognized that continued conflict would damage their commercial interests. A compromise emerged that allowed both cities to continue trading in the eastern Mediterranean, though with reduced privileges compared to their earlier dominance. Venice's relationship with the Papal States reflected calculated diplomacy. The Republic maintained formal respect for papal authority while pursuing its own interests. When papal interests conflicted with Venetian commercial advantage, Venice typically prioritized commerce. The Republic negotiated treaties with the Pope that allowed Venetian merchants to trade in papal territories. In exchange, Venice provided naval support for papal military campaigns when convenient. This arrangement benefited both parties while allowing Venice to maintain independence. Genoa's approach to papal diplomacy differed. Individual Genoese families cultivated relationships with various papal factions. When the papacy experienced internal conflicts, different Genoese families aligned with different sides. This created opportunities for individual families to gain papal favor, yet prevented unified Genoese diplomatic strategy. The Republic could not speak with a single voice to the Pope because powerful families pursued contradictory policies. Marriage diplomacy represented another crucial dimension of alliance building. Venetian merchant families arranged marriages with noble families throughout the Mediterranean. These unions created kinship networks that facilitated commerce and political cooperation. A Venetian merchant married to a Byzantine noble family could leverage family connections to secure trading privileges. These marriage alliances created lasting bonds that transcended individual commercial transactions. Genoese families pursued similar strategies, yet with different consequences. Individual families arranged marriages to advance their particular interests. A Doria family marriage might strengthen connections to Aragonese nobility, while a Spinola family marriage connected them to French nobility. These diverse marriage alliances created networks of obligation that often conflicted with one another. When Aragonese and French interests diverged, Genoese families found themselves pulled in opposite directions. Venice's pragmatic approach to the Ottoman Empire proved consequential across the 14th and 15th centuries. As Ottoman power expanded, Venice negotiated treaties allowing continued commerce in Ottoman-controlled territories. These agreements required Venice to accept Ottoman sovereignty and pay tribute, yet they preserved Venetian commercial networks. Genoa pursued similar negotiations, yet with less success. Genoese merchants faced greater restrictions in Ottoman ports. The Republic could not negotiate the favourable terms that Venice secured. Historians continue to debate whether Venice's pragmatism represented wisdom or moral compromise. The Republic maintained commercial relations with Islamic powers, while Christian Europe pursued crusades against them. Venice profited from trade with Ottoman territories, even as Christian armies fought Ottoman forces. This apparent contradiction troubled contemporaries who valued religious solidarity, yet Venice understood that commercial advantage transcended religious ideology. The Republic's willingness to negotiate with non-Christian powers ultimately strengthened its position in Mediterranean commerce. Genoa's alliance with Aragon represented a crucial strategic choice. The Republic supported Aragonese naval expansion in the western Mediterranean. In exchange, Aragon provided military assistance against Venetian forces. This alliance allowed Genoa to compete with Venice in regions where Genoese strength alone would prove insufficient. Yet the alliance created dependency. Genoa could not pursue policies that conflicted with Aragonese interests. When Aragonese priorities shifted, Genoese strategy had to adjust accordingly. The fundamental difference between Venetian and Genoese diplomacy lay in their conception of alliance. Venice viewed alliances as instruments for advancing commercial interests. The Republic negotiated agreements that served Venetian advantage, then honoured those agreements consistently. This reliability made Venice a valued ally. Other powers could trust Venetian commitments because the Republic fulfilled its obligations. Genoa's alliances reflected factional interests more than state strategy. Individual families pursued alliances that advanced their particular advantage. When circumstances changed, families abandoned previous commitments. This created opportunities for rapid tactical adjustment, yet it prevented the kind of sustained alliance networks that Venice developed. Other powers learned not to trust Genoese commitments because they could not predict which faction would control policy. By the mid-14th century, Venice's alliance network had become substantially more extensive than Genoa's. The Republic maintained favourable relationships with the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Papal States, and various Italian powers. These alliances created multiple pathways for Venetian commerce. If one route became blocked, others remained open. Genoa's alliances, by contrast, remained more limited and less reliable. The Republic depended heavily on Aragonese support, creating vulnerability if that alliance fractured. These alliance structures would prove crucial when the two cities faced their most severe conflict. Venice's institutional stability and reliable diplomatic relationships would allow coordinated response to crisis. Genoa's factional divisions and unstable alliances would fragment under pressure. The alliances that each city constructed during this period essentially predetermine the outcome of their ultimate confrontation. The merchant culture of Venice reflected a particular conception of individual ambition within collective frameworks. A Venetian merchant understood his wealth as inseparable from the Republic's prosperity. Personal fortune and state success intertwined. A merchant who enriched himself through practices that damaged Venice's interests ultimately damaged his own position. This alignment of incentives created a culture where individual ambition served collective benefit. Venetian patricians received education emphasizing governance and service to the state. Young men from merchant families studied law, diplomacy, and administration alongside commercial skills. They understood themselves as future leaders of the Republic, not merely as individual entrepreneurs. Family wealth mattered, yet family position within the state structure mattered more. A merchant family's influence derived partly from its commercial success, but equally from its members' roles in government and military service. The Genoese merchant culture operated according to different principles. A Genoese merchant pursued wealth primarily for his family's benefit. Individual, family success mattered more than collective state prosperity. A merchant who enriched himself through practices that damaged other Genoese families' interests faced no institutional penalty. Competition between families was accepted as natural. Ambition meant advancing family interests, even at the expense of other families or the state itself. Genoese nobility maintained traditions of military independence that shaped merchant culture profoundly. Powerful families controlled fortifications and maintained private armies. A merchant family's status derived partly from its commercial success, but equally from its military capability. A family that controlled significant military force could protect its commercial interests and pursue independent foreign policies. This created a culture where individual families functioned almost as independent states within the larger framework of the Republic. Venetian law required wealthy merchants to fund public works. A merchant who accumulated substantial wealth faced obligations to contribute to the construction of public buildings, bridges, or fortifications. These requirements ensured that private wealth circulated back into collective infrastructure. They also created incentives for merchants to invest in ventures that strengthened the state. A merchant who funded the construction of a new arsenal or a fortified trading post enhanced both his own reputation and the state's military capability. Genoa imposed no comparable requirements on wealthy merchants. Individual families retained control over their accumulated wealth. A merchant could accumulate enormous fortune without any obligation to contribute to public works. This created greater wealth inequality than Venice experienced. It also created different incentives. Genoese merchants invested their wealth in family palaces, private armies, and family-controlled enterprises rather than in collective infrastructure. The role of women differed markedly between the two cities. Venetian merchant wives typically managed household affairs and raised children, yet they also participated in commercial decision-making. A widow often inherited her husband's commercial interests and managed them directly. Venetian law recognized women's property rights and allowed them to conduct commerce independently. This created a broader base of commercial expertise within Venetian society. Women's participation in commerce meant that merchant families retained continuity even when male heirs proved incompetent. Genoese women occupied more restricted roles. Noble and merchant families maintained stricter separation between male and female spheres. Women managed households but rarely participated in commercial decision-making. A widow might inherit her husband's wealth, yet she typically entrusted its management to male relatives or professional administrators. This created narrower bases of commercial expertise. When male heirs proved incompetent, families lacked alternative sources of capable leadership, Architecture reflected these cultural differences vividly. Venice invested in public monuments, the Basilica of San Marco, the Doge's Palace, the Arsenal. These structures represented collective achievement and state power. They communicated Venice's prosperity and stability to visitors and merchants. The city's architecture conveyed a message. Venice is permanent, Venice is powerful. Venice is a place where commerce flourishes under stable governance. Genoa's architecture told a different story. Wealthy families constructed private palaces of extraordinary beauty and expense. The Palazzo Spinola, the Palazzo Doria, the Palazzo Fieschi. These represented individual family achievement and power. They communicated a different message. This family is wealthy. This family is powerful. This family is worth doing business with. Genoese architecture celebrated individual families rather than collective institutions. The education of young merchants reflected these cultural values. Venetian merchants trained their sons in navigation, accounting, and diplomacy. They taught them to view commerce as a systematic enterprise requiring knowledge of law, geography, and political relationships. A well-educated Venetian merchant understood not merely how to conduct individual transactions, but how to operate within complex institutional frameworks. He learned to think in terms of long-term strategy rather than immediate profit. Genoese merchants trained their sons differently. They emphasized practical skills, navigation, negotiation, risk assessment. A Genoese merchant learned to identify profitable opportunities and exploit them quickly. He learned to compete aggressively against rivals. He learned to build personal networks of obligation and alliance. These skills created excellent individual merchants, yet they did not necessarily create merchants capable of operating within complex institutional frameworks. The concept of family legacy differed between the two cities. Venetian families viewed their legacy as their position within the state structure. A family's influence depended on maintaining favorable relationships with other merchant families and with state institutions. Wealth mattered, yet institutional position mattered more. A family that lost its wealth but retained its position within the Great Council remained influential. A family that accumulated wealth but lacked institutional position remained marginal. Genoese families viewed their legacy as their accumulated wealth and military power. A family's influence depended on its ability to maintain and expand its fortune. Institutional position mattered less than direct control over resources. A family that lost its wealth but retained some position within state institutions became irrelevant. A family that accumulated wealth but lacked institutional position could still exercise considerable power through its economic resources. Risk-taking culture differed between the two cities in ways that shaped long-term outcomes. Venetian merchants accepted moderate risks in pursuit of steady profits. A merchant might invest in a trading venture expecting returns of 20 to 30% over several years. He would avoid ventures promising extraordinary profits because such ventures typically involved excessive risk. This conservative approach meant that Venetian merchants rarely experienced catastrophic losses, yet they also rarely achieved spectacular wealth. Genoese merchants pursued higher-risk ventures in pursuit of extraordinary profits. A merchant might invest in a venture promising returns of 200% if successful, yet risking total loss if circumstances shifted. This aggressive approach meant that some Genoese merchants accumulated wealth far exceeding what Venetian merchants typically achieved. It also meant that Genoese merchants experienced more frequent bankruptcies and financial ruin. These cultural differences shaped how each city's merchant class responded to challenges and opportunities. When circumstances changed, Venetian merchants adapted within established frameworks. They sought consensus before pursuing new strategies. They invested in institutional solutions to problems. Genoese merchants adapted more rapidly, yet without institutional coordination. Individual families pursued different strategies. Some adapted successfully, while others failed to adjust. By the 14th century, These cultural differences had created two distinct types of merchant societies. Venice produced merchants who understood themselves as servants of an institution larger than themselves. Genoa produced merchants who understood themselves as independent actors pursuing family advantage. Neither culture was inherently superior. Yet in the context of Mediterranean competition, Venice's culture of institutional loyalty would prove more advantageous than Genoa's culture of individual ambition. The 14th century witnessed both Venice and Genoa at the height of their power. Yet this apparent strength masked underlying vulnerabilities. Both cities controlled vast commercial networks extending across the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea. Both maintained formidable naval forces. Both accumulated wealth at unprecedented rates. Yet both stretched their resources thin across territories they could not easily defend. Venice's territorial empire required constant military expenditure. The Republic maintained garrisons in Crete, Cyprus, and numerous smaller islands. These forces protected trading posts and prevented rival powers from seizing Venetian possessions. Yet maintaining distant garrisons consumed resources that might otherwise fund commercial expansion. Venice faced a fundamental strategic problem: how to defend an empire spread across vast distances with limited military resources. Genoa faced different but equally serious challenges. The Republic's decentralized structure created chronic instability. Powerful families competed for control of government. When one family dominated, rivals plotted to overthrow them. This internal conflict diverted resources and attention from external threats. Genoa's merchant families accumulated wealth, yet the state lacked the institutional cohesion necessary to deploy that wealth effectively for collective purposes. Competition for Crete intensified during the mid-14th century. Both Venice and Genoa sought to control this strategically valuable island. Venice held Crete, yet Genoa launched repeated challenges to Venetian authority. Naval battles erupted as Genoese fleets attempted to seize Venetian possessions. These conflicts remained inconclusive. Neither city possessed sufficient military power to eliminate the other's presence on the island. Cyprus represented another flashpoint. Venice acquired Cyprus through marriage alliance in 1489, yet the island remained contested. Genoese merchants operated in Cypriot ports and competed for trade. Both cities sought to monopolize commerce flowing through Cyprus. The competition for control of this island illustrated the fundamental antagonism between the two powers. The Mediterranean could not accommodate both cities' imperial ambitions. The War of Chioggia erupted in 1378 and continued until 1381. This conflict represented the most severe confrontation between Venice and Genoa prior to Lepanto. The war emerged from accumulated tensions over trade routes, territorial possessions, and commercial privileges. Genoa allied with Hungary and other powers hostile to Venice. The coalition mobilized significant military force against the Venetian Republic. Genoa achieved initial success in the conflict. Genoese fleets defeated Venetian naval forces in several engagements. The Genoese commander Paganino Doria proved an exceptionally capable military leader. His tactics outmaneuvered Venetian forces repeatedly. Genoa's mercenary fleets operated with greater tactical flexibility than Venice's more rigid institutional navy. For a period, it appeared that Genoa might achieve decisive victory. Yet Genoa's internal divisions undermined the war effort. Different Genoese families pursued contradictory strategies. Some families invested heavily in the conflict, while others held back resources, waiting to see which side would prevail. Paganino Doria, though an excellent commander, operated as a mercenary rather than as a representative of unified Genoese state power. When circumstances shifted, Doria's commitment to the conflict wavered. He could not draw upon the kind of institutional loyalty that Venice could mobilize. Venice experienced severe internal crisis during the War of Chioggia. Factional conflicts erupted within the merchant elite. Some families questioned whether the war could be won. Others advocated for negotiated settlement rather than continued conflict. The Great Council debated strategy intensely. Yet despite these internal divisions, Venice maintained institutional cohesion. The Republic could not be paralyzed by factional conflict because the state structure transcended any individual faction. The turning point came when Venice mobilized its full institutional resources. The Republic commissioned new ships from the arsenal at an unprecedented rate. It recalled military forces from distant territories to concentrate them against Genoa. It negotiated support from allies, securing additional naval forces. This coordinated mobilization of state resources proved decisive. Venice could sustain the conflict longer than Genoa because the Republic could access resources that individual Genoese families could not match. Genoa's failure to press its initial advantage proved consequential. When Paganino Doria achieved military superiority, he should have pursued total victory. Instead, he hesitated. He negotiated with Venetian representatives, considering terms of settlement. This hesitation allowed Venice time to recover. By the time Genoa resumed aggressive operations, Venice had mobilized sufficient resources to resist effectively. The war's conclusion through negotiation rather than victory illustrated both cities' limitations. Neither possessed sufficient military power to eliminate the other. Both recognized that continued conflict would damage their commercial interests. A settlement emerged that allowed both cities to continue operating in the Mediterranean, though with reduced privileges compared to their earlier dominance. The War of Chioggia revealed crucial truths about each city's capabilities and limitations. Venice's institutional structure allowed it to sustain prolonged conflict. The Republic could mobilize resources across its entire territory and concentrate them where needed. Individual factions might disagree about strategy, yet the state structure prevented paralysis. Venice could endure hardship that would destroy a less cohesive political entity. Genoa's decentralized structure created both advantages and disadvantages. Individual families could pursue aggressive strategies without requiring consensus from other families. Genoese commanders could operate with greater tactical flexibility than Venetian counterparts. Yet Genoa could not sustain prolonged conflict because the state lacked institutional mechanisms for mobilizing collective resources. When the war dragged on, individual families' commitment wavered. Resources that should have been concentrated became dispersed as families pursued their own interests. The aftermath of Chioggia demonstrated Venice's resilience. The Republic recovered from the conflict and resumed commercial dominance. Genoese merchants faced greater restrictions in Venetian-controlled territories. Venice's victory, though not total, shifted the balance of power decisively in Venice's favour. Genoa remained a significant maritime power, yet it could no longer challenge Venice's dominance effectively. Historians continue to debate whether Genoa could have won the War of Chioggia if leadership had been more unified. The Republic possessed excellent commanders, capable merchants, and substantial resources. Yet the decentralized political structure prevented the kind of coordinated effort that sustained Venice. This fundamental structural difference would prove decisive in the ultimate confrontation between the two cities. When both mobilized their full power, Venice's institutional cohesion would prove superior to Genoa's individual excellence. The decades following Chioggia witnessed growing Venetian dominance and gradual Genoese decline. Venice consolidated its control over eastern Mediterranean trade routes. Genoa's merchant families pursued increasingly independent strategies, unable to coordinate collective response to Venetian pressure. The fundamental question was no longer whether Venice would dominate, but how completely Genoa would be subordinated. The Ottoman Empire's expansion across the Mediterranean during the 16th century transformed the strategic landscape. Turkish fleets seized territories that Venice and Genoa had controlled for centuries. Cyprus fell to Ottoman forces in 1570. Crete remained under Venetian control but faced constant Ottoman pressure. Both cities recognized that the Ottoman threat transcended their rivalry. a unified Christian response became necessary for survival. The Holy League emerged as an unlikely alliance. Venice, Genoa, the Papal States, Spain, and other Christian powers agreed to coordinate naval operations against the Ottoman Empire. This coalition represented a dramatic shift in Mediterranean politics. Rivals who had fought one another for 3 centuries now mobilized collectively against a common enemy. The alliance required extraordinary diplomatic effort. Each power pursued its own interests, yet all recognized that Ottoman dominance threatened their commercial networks and territorial possessions. Venice approached the alliance pragmatically. The Republic understood that Ottoman expansion threatened its eastern Mediterranean empire. Cyprus's fall demonstrated Ottoman military capability. Venice committed substantial naval forces to the Holy League, yet the Republic also negotiated separately with Ottoman rulers. Venice maintained the possibility of negotiated settlements with the Ottomans even while fighting them militarily. This dual strategy reflected Venice's fundamental approach to power: pursue advantage through every available means. Genoa's participation in the Holy League reflected different calculations. The Republic possessed fewer territorial possessions in the eastern Mediterranean than Venice. Genoa's primary concern was protecting its Black Sea trading posts from Ottoman interference. The Republic committed naval forces to the alliance, yet with less enthusiasm than Venice. Genoese commanders questioned whether the coalition could achieve decisive victory. Some Genoese merchant families opposed the alliance, fearing that military expenditure would damage their commercial interests. The Battle of Lepanto occurred on October 7, 1571, in the Gulf of Patras off the coast of Greece. The Christian fleet consisted of approximately 207 galleys and 6 galleots. The Ottoman fleet numbered roughly 222 galleys. Both sides mobilized their available naval forces. The battle represented the largest galley engagement in Mediterranean history. Tens of thousands of men participated in the conflict. Venice contributed the largest Christian contingent. The Republic provided approximately 106 galleys and numerous support vessels. Venetian commanders held senior positions within the Christian fleet hierarchy. The Republic's naval forces represented the most disciplined and professionally trained component of the Christian alliance. Venetian galleys operated according to established tactical doctrines. Crews trained extensively in coordinated maneuvers. Officers understood the importance of maintaining formation and supporting adjacent vessels. Genoa's contribution proved more limited. The Republic provided approximately 12 galleys under the command of Giovanni Andrea Doria, nephew of the famous Admiral Andrea Doria. Genoese forces occupied a position on the right flank of the Christian fleet. The Genoese contingent was substantially smaller than Venice's contribution. This reflected both Genoa's reduced naval capacity and the Republic's ambivalent commitment to the alliance. The battle's opening phase witnessed the Christian fleet advancing toward the Ottoman forces in coordinated formation. Venetian galleys occupied the centre, with Allied forces distributed along the flanks. The Ottoman fleet attempted to outmaneuver the Christian formation by extending their line. Both sides sought to gain positional advantage before engaging in close combat. The main engagement erupted when the two fleets closed to effective cannon range. Venetian gunners proved exceptionally accurate. The Republic's investment in artillery training and standardized gunnery practices demonstrated its value. Venetian cannons inflicted severe casualties on Ottoman vessels. The Ottoman fleet's formation began to deteriorate as damaged ships fell out of line. Genoese forces on the right flank faced intense Ottoman pressure. The Genoese contingent found itself threatened with encirclement. Giovanni Andrea Doria made the controversial decision to withdraw his galleys rather than risk their destruction. This withdrawal created a gap in the Christian line. Ottoman forces exploited this opening, threatening to break through the Christian formation. The withdrawal of Genoese forces illustrated the fundamental difference between Venice's institutional commitment and Genoa's mercenary approach. Venetian commanders understood that they served the Republic's interests. Withdrawal would damage Venice's reputation and strategic position. Genoese commanders, by contrast, operated as professional military men hired for specific campaigns. Preserving their forces took priority over achieving collective victory. When circumstances became unfavourable, withdrawal seemed prudent. Yet the Genoese withdrawal ultimately proved inconsequential. Venetian forces in the centre pressed their advantage aggressively. The Ottoman fleet's formation collapsed under sustained Venetian assault. Ottoman commanders could not coordinate effective response to the Christian onslaught. The battle transformed from a closely contested engagement into a rout. Ottoman vessels attempted to flee. Christian forces pursued them relentlessly. The casualty figures reflected the battle's severity. The Ottoman fleet suffered approximately 30,000 casualties. The Christian alliance lost approximately 7,700 men. The Ottoman fleet lost roughly 190 galleys captured or destroyed. The Christian alliance lost approximately 15 galleys. The victory was decisive and overwhelming. The Ottoman Empire's naval dominance in the Mediterranean effectively ended. What the battle revealed transcended the immediate military outcome. Lepanto demonstrated that Venice's institutional approach to naval warfare proved superior to Ottoman methods. Venetian coordination, training, and discipline created advantages that individual courage and tactical skill could not overcome. The battle also demonstrated that Genoa's mercenary approach, while producing capable individual commanders, could not match Venice's institutional commitment to collective victory. The contrast between Venetian and Genoese participation illustrated broader differences in how each city approached power. Venice mobilized its full institutional resources for the battle. The Republic committed its best ships, most experienced commanders, and most highly trained crews. Venice understood that the battle's outcome would determine the Republic's future in the Mediterranean. Genoa contributed forces, yet without the same level of institutional commitment. Genoese commanders pursued the battle as a professional military engagement rather than as an existential struggle for the Republic's survival. The aftermath of Lepanto revealed the battle's limitations as a decisive turning point. The Ottoman Empire recovered from its naval losses more rapidly than Christian powers anticipated. Within a few years, Ottoman shipyards reconstructed the destroyed fleet. The Ottoman Empire remained a formidable Mediterranean power despite Lepanto's outcome. Yet the battle demonstrated that Ottoman naval dominance was not inevitable. Christian powers could challenge Ottoman expansion effectively. For Venice and Genoa, Lepanto's significance lay not in defeating the Ottomans, but in revealing which city possessed superior institutional capacity for sustained military effort. Venice's coordinated response to the Ottoman threat demonstrated the Republic's ability to mobilize collective resources effectively. Genoa's more limited participation reflected the Republic's internal divisions and reduced capacity for coordinated action. The battle confirmed what the War of Chioggia had suggested. Venice possessed institutional advantages that Genoa could not match. Historians continue to debate whether Lepanto represented a truly decisive turning point or merely a symbolic victory. The Ottoman Empire remained powerful despite the battle's outcome. Yet for Venice and Genoa, Lepanto clarified their relative positions in Mediterranean politics. Venice emerged as the undisputed leader of Christian naval forces. Genoa's role diminished to that of a supporting power. The battle did not determine the ultimate outcome of Venice and Genoa's rivalry, yet it provided clear evidence of which city possessed superior capacity for sustained power projection. The decades following Lepanto witnessed Venice's consolidation of Mediterranean dominance. The Republic emerged from the battle as the undisputed leader of Christian naval forces. Venetian merchants expanded their trading networks into territories previously contested by Genoa. The Republic's commercial monopolies strengthened. Venetian galleys patrolled Mediterranean routes with minimal opposition. The city's wealth accumulated at unprecedented rates. Genoa's position deteriorated markedly after Lepanto. The Republic's reduced naval capacity limited its ability to protect merchant vessels or enforce commercial privileges. Genoese merchants faced increasing restrictions in Venetian-controlled territories. Trading posts that Genoese families had maintained for centuries fell under Venetian control or became economically marginal. The Republic's merchant class recognized that the era of Genoese Mediterranean dominance had ended. The 16th and 17th centuries witnessed Venice's territorial consolidation. The Republic acquired additional islands and coastal territories. Venetian garrisons strengthened fortifications throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The state invested heavily in military infrastructure designed to project power across vast distances. Venice's Stato da Mar transformed from a collection of trading posts into a coherent territorial empire. The Republic controlled the most valuable Mediterranean trade routes. Venetian merchants monopolized the spice trade, the silk trade, and numerous other profitable commodities. Genoa's internal structure fragmented further during this period. Powerful merchant families pursued increasingly independent strategies. The Doria family, once dominant in Genoese politics, lost influence to rival families. The Spinola family rose to prominence, yet their power remained contested. The Republic could not coordinate collective response to Venetian pressure because factional conflicts consumed political energy. Individual families negotiated separately with Venice, accepting unfavorable terms rather than coordinating collective resistance. The Ottoman threat, which had temporarily united Venice and Genoa, receded after Lepanto. The Ottoman Empire remained powerful, yet it no longer posed an existential threat to Christian Mediterranean commerce. This reduction in external pressure removed the primary incentive for Venice and Genoa to maintain their alliance. The two cities returned to their fundamental antagonism, yet the balance of power had shifted decisively in Venice's favour. Venice's cultural dominance accompanied its commercial and military dominance. The Republic invested enormous wealth in artistic and architectural projects. The Basilica of San Marco underwent renovation and expansion. Venetian painters and sculptors achieved international renown. The city became a destination for scholars, artists, and merchants seeking to participate in Venetian cultural life. This cultural flowering reinforced Venice's image as the Mediterranean's preeminent power. Genoa's cultural significance diminished correspondingly. The Republic produced capable artists and scholars, yet they operated in Venice's shadow. Genoese families invested in private palaces and family chapels rather than in public cultural institutions. The city's cultural output reflected factional divisions rather than collective achievement. Genoa remained wealthy, yet it no longer represented the Mediterranean's cultural centre. The fundamental truth underlying Genoa's decline was not military defeat but institutional failure. Genoa did not lose to Venice because Venetian ships were superior or Venetian commanders more capable. Genoa lost because the Republic's decentralized structure prevented coordinated response to Venetian pressure. Individual Genoese families pursued their own interests rather than collective Genoese interests. When Venice mobilized its institutional resources, Genoa could not match this coordinated effort. Genoa's pivot toward banking and finance represented a significant transformation. As maritime commerce became increasingly dominated by Venice, Genoese merchant families shifted their capital toward financial services. Genoese bankers financed Spanish kings, Portuguese explorers, and various European powers. The Spinola family, the Pallavicini family, and other Genoese merchant families became international bankers rather than Mediterranean merchants. This transformation allowed Genoese families to accumulate wealth despite their declining position in maritime commerce. Yet this financial transformation represented a loss of identity for Genoa. The Republic had emerged as a maritime power. Genoese identity was inseparable from the sea. As the city's merchant families shifted toward banking, Genoa ceased to function as a unified maritime republic. Individual families pursued financial interests in distant European capitals. The city itself became less significant as a political entity. Genoa survived, yet the Genoa that had been, the Genoa of merchant republics and maritime dominance, effectively ceased to exist. Venice's increasing rigidity during this period sowed seeds of its own eventual decline. The Republic's monopoly system, which had generated sustained advantage, became increasingly inflexible. Venetian law protected established merchant families' monopolies against new competitors. Young merchants from families without established trading privileges found it nearly impossible to enter the merchant class. The system that had created incentives for excellence now created incentives for complacency. Merchants who held monopolies had no reason to innovate or improve their operations. The Arsenal, once the world's most advanced shipyard, began producing outdated designs. Venetian shipwrights continued to build galleys long after other maritime powers recognized that galleys were becoming obsolete. Larger sailing ships with greater cargo capacity and superior seaworthiness were replacing galleys on major trade routes. Venice's institutional commitment to galley production prevented rapid adaptation to this technological shift. The Republic's greatest strength, its institutional stability, became a source of vulnerability. Trade route changes during the 16th and 17th centuries created challenges for both Venice and Genoa. Portuguese explorers discovered sea routes to Asia around the Cape of Good Hope. This route bypassed the Mediterranean entirely. Spices and other Asian goods could now reach European markets without passing through Venice's monopoly system. Both cities' commercial advantages eroded as trade patterns shifted away from the Mediterranean. Venice adapted to this challenge more effectively than Genoa, yet neither city fully embraced the New World Order. Venice invested in land-based agriculture and maintained its Mediterranean dominance, accepting reduced profits rather than pursuing Atlantic trade aggressively. Genoese families pursued banking and finance rather than adapting to new maritime opportunities. Neither city positioned itself to dominate Atlantic commerce as Portuguese and Spanish powers did. The fundamental difference between Venice and Genoa's decline trajectories lay in institutional capacity. Venice declined slowly because the Republic's institutions maintained stability even as external circumstances changed. Genoa's decline accelerated because the Republic's institutions fragmented under pressure. Venice could coordinate collective response to challenges, even if that response proved inadequate. Genoa could not coordinate any response because factional conflicts prevented unified action. By the end of the 17th century, both cities had ceased to function as major Mediterranean powers. Yet Venice retained greater wealth, greater cultural significance, and greater political autonomy than Genoa. The Republic maintained its territorial possessions and its commercial networks. Genoa had lost most of its territories, and its merchant families operated primarily as international bankers rather than as Mediterranean merchants. The War of Chioggia and the Battle of Lepanto had not determined the ultimate outcome of Venice and Genoa's rivalry, yet they had clarified which city possessed superior institutional capacity for sustained power projection. The age of exploration transformed global commerce fundamentally. Portuguese navigators discovered sea routes to Asia that bypassed the Mediterranean entirely. Spanish explorers opened Atlantic trade routes to the Americas. These discoveries redirected commercial flows away from the Mediterranean toward the Atlantic Ocean. Venice and Genoa, cities that had accumulated wealth through Mediterranean dominance, confronted a world where their traditional advantages meant progressively less. The Cape of Good Hope route, established by Portuguese explorers in the late 15th century, represented a direct challenge to Venice's spice monopoly. Spices could now reach European markets through Atlantic ports rather than through Mediterranean channels. Prices fell as competition increased. Venice's monopoly system, which had generated extraordinary profits through scarcity, became obsolete when alternative supply routes emerged. The Republic's carefully constructed commercial framework collapsed as external circumstances shifted beyond its control. Venice's response to this challenge revealed both the Republic's strengths and its fundamental limitations. The state recognized the threat posed by Atlantic trade routes. Venetian merchants invested in land-based agriculture, particularly in the Veneto region. The Republic acquired agricultural territories and invested in irrigation systems and crop production. This diversification allowed Venice to maintain wealth even as Mediterranean commerce declined. Yet it represented a retreat from maritime dominance rather than an adaptation to new opportunities. Genoa's response differed markedly. The Republic's merchant families could not coordinate collective investment in new ventures. Individual families pursued separate strategies. Some Genoese merchants invested in banking and finance, recognizing that financial services would become increasingly important as trade patterns shifted. Others attempted to maintain Mediterranean commerce despite declining profitability. Still others invested in Atlantic trade ventures, yet without coordinated state support. Genoa's decentralized structure allowed individual families to adapt quickly, yet prevented the kind of sustained institutional response that Venice maintained. The Ottoman consolidation of Mediterranean territories during the 16th and 17th centuries further reduced the region's commercial significance. Ottoman rulers controlled the most valuable Mediterranean trade routes. They imposed restrictions on Christian merchants and collected substantial tribute. The Mediterranean, which had been the center of European commerce, became increasingly marginal as Atlantic trade expanded. Both Venice and Genoa faced declining returns on their Mediterranean investments. Venice's institutional response to these challenges demonstrated the Republic's capacity for strategic adaptation. The state invested heavily in maintaining its territorial possessions despite reduced profitability. Venetian garrisons strengthened fortifications. The Republic negotiated treaties with Ottoman rulers, securing favorable terms for Venetian merchants. Venice accepted reduced profits in exchange for maintaining its position as a significant Mediterranean power. This strategy preserved Venice's wealth and influence, though at the cost of accepting diminished returns. Genoa's institutional fragmentation prevented coordinated response to changing circumstances. Individual merchant families pursued contradictory strategies. Some families invested in Atlantic trade ventures, yet without state coordination or support. Others maintained Mediterranean commerce, hoping that profitability would eventually recover. Still others shifted entirely toward banking and finance. The Republic could not establish a unified economic strategy because factional conflicts prevented consensus. The Genoese banking families represented a significant innovation in European finance. The Spinola family, the Pallavicini family, and other Genoese merchant families developed sophisticated financial instruments and practices. They financed European monarchs, funded military campaigns, and managed international credit networks. These families accumulated wealth that rivaled or exceeded what traditional Mediterranean merchants could generate. Yet this financial success represented a transformation of Genoese identity rather than a continuation of Genoese maritime dominance. Venice's investment in land-based agriculture reflected a fundamental shift in the Republic's economic orientation. The state acquired extensive territories in the Veneto region. Venetian nobles invested in agricultural estates and irrigation systems. The Republic's wealth increasingly derived from agricultural production rather than from maritime commerce. This transformation allowed Venice to maintain its position as a wealthy power, yet it represented a retreat from the maritime dominance that had defined Venetian identity for centuries. The decline of Mediterranean trade created different pressures for each city. Venice could sustain itself through agricultural wealth and reduced Mediterranean commerce. The Republic's territorial possessions provided alternative sources of revenue. Genoa lacked comparable agricultural resources. The city's wealth depended almost entirely on commerce and finance. As Mediterranean commerce declined, Genoese merchants faced pressure to find alternative sources of profit. Both cities recognized the significance of Atlantic trade routes, yet neither positioned itself to dominate Atlantic commerce effectively. Portuguese and Spanish powers controlled the most valuable Atlantic routes. Venice and Genoa, cities that had accumulated wealth through Mediterranean dominance, found themselves marginal players in the new Atlantic-centered world order. Both cities attempted to participate in Atlantic trade, yet without the geographic advantages that Portuguese and Spanish powers possessed. Venice's rigidity during this period reflected the Republic's institutional characteristics. The state's monopoly system, designed to maintain control over Mediterranean commerce, prevented rapid adaptation to new circumstances. Venetian merchants trained in Mediterranean trade found themselves ill-equipped to compete in Atlantic ventures. The Republic's institutional framework, which had generated sustained advantage in the Mediterranean, created obstacles to adaptation in the Atlantic world. Genoa's flexibility during this period reflected the Republic's decentralized structure. Individual merchant families could pursue Atlantic trade ventures without requiring state approval. Genoese merchants, accustomed to competing aggressively against rivals, adapted more readily to Atlantic commerce. Yet without coordinated state support, individual Genoese ventures could not match the resources that Portuguese and Spanish powers mobilized for Atlantic exploration and trade. The fundamental irony of this period lay in how each city's greatest strengths became sources of vulnerability. Venice's institutional stability, which had generated sustained Mediterranean dominance, prevented rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Genoa's decentralized structure, which had allowed flexibility in Mediterranean competition, prevented coordinated response to the Atlantic challenge. Neither city possessed the institutional characteristics necessary to dominate Atlantic trade effectively. By the 17th century, both Venice and Genoa had ceased to function as major players in global commerce. The Mediterranean, which had been the center of European trade for centuries, became increasingly marginal. Atlantic commerce, controlled by Portuguese and Spanish powers, dominated European trade. Venice and Genoa, cities that had accumulated extraordinary wealth through Mediterranean dominance, found themselves economically marginalized in the New World Order. Yet Venice maintained greater wealth and greater political autonomy than Genoa. The Republic's agricultural investments and its maintained Mediterranean position allowed it to sustain itself as a significant power. Genoa's merchant families, though individually wealthy through banking and finance, could not coordinate collective action to maintain the Republic's political independence. Genoa's transformation from maritime republic to collection of banking families represented a loss of political autonomy even as individual families accumulated wealth. Venice in the 17th and 18th centuries transformed into a museum of its own past. The Republic maintained its wealth and its territorial possessions, yet it ceased to function as a dynamic commercial power. Venetian merchants operated within frameworks established centuries earlier. Innovation became suspect. Tradition became sacred. The city that had pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, standardized ship design, and systematic navigation now resisted new methods and new ideas. The Great Council, once a deliberative body where merchants debated strategy and made collective decisions, became a ceremonial institution. Membership remained hereditary, yet participation declined. Younger merchants from established families showed little interest in governance. They preferred to manage their inherited wealth rather than engage in political affairs. The institutional framework that had generated sustained advantage through collective decision-making lost its vitality. The machine continued to operate, yet without the energy that had driven it for centuries. Venetian culture during this period reflected nostalgia rather than innovation. The Republic invested enormous wealth in artistic and architectural projects, celebrating its past glory. Painters depicted scenes of Venetian triumph. Architects designed buildings, imitating classical styles. The city became a stage set where the past was constantly reenacted. Visitors travelled to Venice to witness the remnants of a great civilization, not to participate in a living commercial enterprise. The Venetian Carnival, which emerged during this period, represented the city's cultural transformation. The festival celebrated pleasure, spectacle, and fantasy. Masked revelers moved through the city for weeks each year. The carnival reflected Venice's shift from a society organized around commerce and governance to a society organized around entertainment and display. The city that had accumulated wealth through disciplined commercial activity now invested in elaborate festivals and public spectacles. Genoa's cultural decline followed a different trajectory. The Republic did not experience the kind of artistic and architectural flowering that Venice maintained. Genoese families invested in private palaces and family chapels rather than in public cultural institutions. The city lacked unified cultural identity. Individual families pursued their own cultural projects without coordinating collective effort. Genoa remained wealthy, yet it ceased to function as a coherent cultural entity. The fragmentation of Genoese identity reflected deeper institutional collapse. The Republic that had emerged as a unified maritime power gradually dissolved into a collection of wealthy families operating independently. The Doria family, once dominant in Genoese politics, lost influence to rival families. The Spinola family rose to prominence, yet their power remained contested. The Fieschi family pursued their own interests. Individual families negotiated separately with foreign powers, often pursuing contradictory policies. Genoa's loss of Corsica to France in 1768 symbolized the Republic's declining power. Corsica had represented a crucial strategic possession for centuries. The island provided naval bases, agricultural resources, and strategic position, controlling Western Mediterranean routes. Genoa's inability to retain Corsica demonstrated the Republic's reduced military capacity. The state could not defend its possessions against determined foreign pressure. Individual Genoese families lacked the institutional coordination necessary to mobilize collective defense. The paradox of this period lay in how success bred the conditions for failure. Venice's institutional stability, which had generated sustained advantage, created rigidity that prevented adaptation. Merchants trained in established methods resisted innovation. Laws designed to protect established monopolies prevented new competitors from entering commerce. The system that had created incentives for excellence now created incentives for complacency. Established merchants had no reason to improve their operations or explore new opportunities. Genoa's decentralized structure, which had allowed flexibility in earlier periods, now prevented unified response to challenges. Individual families pursued their own interests rather than collective Genoese interests. When external pressure mounted, the Republic could not mobilize coordinated defense. Factional conflicts consumed political energy that might have been directed toward adapting to changing circumstances. The system that had allowed rapid tactical adjustment now prevented strategic adaptation. Venice's investment in land-based agriculture represented a fundamental shift in the Republic's identity. Venetian nobles acquired agricultural estates in the Veneto region. They invested in irrigation systems and crop production. The city's wealth increasingly derived from agricultural rents rather than from maritime commerce. This transformation allowed Venice to maintain its position as a wealthy power, yet it represented a retreat from the maritime dominance that had defined Venetian civilization for centuries. The education of young Venetian merchants reflected this cultural transformation. Young men from merchant families trained in estate management rather than in commerce. They learned to manage agricultural properties and collect rents from peasant farmers. They studied law and political theory rather than navigation and accounting. The The skills necessary for maritime commerce became less valued than the skills necessary for managing landed wealth. Venice's merchant class gradually transformed into a landed aristocracy. Genoa's merchant families pursued different educational paths. Young men trained in banking and finance rather than in maritime commerce. They studied accounting, credit instruments, and international finance. The skills necessary for Mediterranean commerce became less valued than the skills necessary for managing international credit networks. Genoese identity shifted from maritime merchants to international bankers. Individual families accumulated wealth through financial services rather than through commerce. This cultural transformation reflected deeper changes in how each city understood its relationship to power and wealth. Venice's shift toward landed wealth represented an acceptance of reduced commercial dominance. The Republic could not compete with Atlantic powers for global commerce, yet it could maintain itself as a wealthy power through agricultural resources and Mediterranean trade. This strategy preserved Venice's independence and wealth, though at the cost of accepting diminished international significance. Genoa's shift toward banking and finance represented a different kind of adaptation. Individual families could accumulate wealth through financial services even as the Republic's political power declined. Yet this transformation severed the connection between individual, family wealth and collective Genoese power. Wealthy Genoese bankers operated in distant European capitals. They maintained little connection to the Republic itself. Genoa survived as a political entity, yet it ceased to function as a unified civilization. The role of women in Venetian society reflected the city's cultural transformation. As commerce declined in importance, women's participation in commercial decision-making diminished. Venetian women from merchant families increasingly focused on managing household affairs and maintaining family social position. The broader base of commercial expertise that women had provided in earlier centuries contracted. Merchant families relied increasingly on male heirs to manage their affairs, creating vulnerability when heirs proved incompetent. Genoa's treatment of women followed similar patterns. As banking and finance replaced maritime commerce, women's participation in economic decision-making declined. Individual Genoese families maintained strict separation between male and female spheres. Women managed households, but rarely participated in financial decision-making. The narrower bases of economic expertise that resulted created similar vulnerabilities. By the 18th century, both Venice and Genoa had transformed from dynamic commercial republics into static societies organized around maintaining inherited wealth and position. Venice maintained greater cultural significance and greater political autonomy than Genoa. The Republic's investment in artistic and architectural projects preserved Venice's reputation as a center of culture and civilization. Genoa, by contrast, had become economically significant, yet culturally marginal. Individual Genoese families accumulated wealth, yet the Republic itself ceased to function as a coherent cultural entity. The seeds of decline had been planted in the soil of success. Venice's greatest strength, its institutional stability, became a source of rigidity. Genoa's greatest weakness, its factional divisions, prevented coordinated adaptation to changing circumstances. Neither city possessed the institutional characteristics necessary to adapt effectively to the Atlantic-centered world order. Both cities maintained wealth and significance, yet both ceased to function as major powers in global affairs. The victory at Lepanto represented the apex of Venetian power. The Republic emerged from the battle as the undisputed leader of Christian naval forces in the Mediterranean. Venetian merchants controlled the most valuable trade routes. Venetian galleys patrolled Mediterranean waters with minimal opposition. The city's wealth accumulated at unprecedented rates, yet this moment of triumph contained within it the seeds of Venice's eventual decline. Success created vested interests that resisted change. Merchant families who held monopolies on profitable trade routes had no incentive to support innovation that might disrupt their position. The Great Council, which had functioned as a deliberative body where merchants debated strategy, became increasingly dominated by families whose wealth derived from established monopolies. These families used their political power to protect their commercial privileges against new competitors. Venice's monopoly system, which had generated sustained advantage during the medieval and early modern periods, became progressively more rigid. Laws designed to protect established merchants' privileges prevented new families from entering commerce. A young merchant from a family without established trading privileges could not legally compete in monopolized trades. The barriers to entry became insurmountable. Commerce became the exclusive domain of established families. The arsenal, once the world's most advanced shipyard, exemplified Venice's institutional rigidity. The facility continued to produce galleys long after other maritime powers recognized that galleys were becoming obsolete. Larger sailing ships with greater cargo capacity and superior seaworthiness were replacing galleys on major trade routes. Yet Venetian law and tradition mandated galley construction. The arsenal's workers trained in galley production techniques. Changing to new ship designs would require retraining workers and abandoning established practices. Venetian merchants trained in Mediterranean trade found themselves ill-equipped to compete in Atlantic ventures. The skills necessary for Mediterranean commerce, knowledge of established routes, relationships with established suppliers, familiarity with established markets, proved largely irrelevant in Atlantic trade. Young Venetian merchants who attempted to pursue Atlantic ventures lacked the geographic knowledge and established networks that Portuguese and Spanish merchants possessed. The Republic's institutional framework, designed for Mediterranean dominance, created obstacles to Atlantic expansion. The Great Council's composition reflected the calcification of Venetian society. Membership remained hereditary, yet the council increasingly excluded families without established commercial privileges. Younger merchants from families without monopoly positions found political participation impossible. The council became a forum where established families defended their privileges rather than a deliberative body where merchants debated strategy and pursued collective interests. The institution that had generated sustained advantage through collective decision-making lost its vitality. Venice's laws against corruption, which had created confidence in the Republic's institutions, became obstacles to adaptation. Officials who attempted to pursue new policies or support new merchants faced accusations of corruption. The legal framework designed to prevent theft of public funds also prevented officials from supporting ventures that threatened established interests. Rigidity became encoded in law. Innovation became suspect. Deviation from established practice became illegal. The city's investment in artistic and architectural projects reflected a fundamental shift in how Venice understood itself. Rather than investing in new commercial ventures or new technologies, the Republic invested in monuments celebrating its past glory. The Basilica of San Marco underwent constant renovation. New palaces rose throughout the city. Venetian painters and sculptors achieved international renown. Yet these investments represented consumption of wealth rather than investment in future prosperity. The city became increasingly focused on displaying its past achievements rather than on creating new ones. The Venetian Carnival exemplified this cultural transformation. The festival celebrated pleasure, spectacle, and fantasy. Masked revelers moved through the city for weeks each year. The carnival reflected Venice's shift from a society organized around commerce and governance to a society organized around entertainment and display. The city that had accumulated wealth through disciplined commercial activity now invested in elaborate festivals. Visitors traveled to Venice to witness spectacle rather than to conduct commerce. Venetian merchants' resistance to new technologies illustrated the Republic's institutional rigidity. When other maritime powers adopted new navigational instruments and techniques, Venetian merchants often resisted. The compass, initially resisted by conservative Venetian pilots, eventually became standard. Yet other innovations faced similar resistance. New accounting methods, new ship designs, new trade routes all encountered opposition from established merchants who viewed them as threats to their position. The Republic's relationship with the Ottoman Empire reflected Venice's pragmatic approach to commerce, yet also revealed the limits of that pragmatism. Venice maintained commercial relations with Ottoman territories even as Ottoman power expanded. This allowed Venetian merchants to continue trading in Ottoman-controlled ports. Yet it also meant that Venice accepted Ottoman sovereignty over territories the Republic could not defend militarily. Venice's pragmatism preserved commercial advantage, yet it prevented the kind of aggressive expansion that might have maintained Venetian dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The decline of Mediterranean trade created pressures that Venice's institutional framework could not accommodate. The Republic's entire system was designed for Mediterranean dominance. When Mediterranean commerce declined, the system became obsolete. Yet the Republic could not easily transform itself. The laws, institutions, and practices that had generated sustained advantage now prevented adaptation. Venice faced a choice between maintaining its institutional framework and accepting decline, or transforming its institutions and risking internal conflict. Venice chose to maintain its institutional framework. The Republic invested in land-based agriculture rather than pursuing Atlantic commerce aggressively. This strategy preserved Venice's wealth and independence, yet it represented a retreat from maritime dominance. The city that had accumulated wealth through commerce gradually transformed into a city that accumulated wealth through agricultural rents and reduced Mediterranean trade. The transformation was gradual and relatively painless, yet it represented a fundamental loss of the Republic's original character. The Great Council's debates during the 17th century reflected growing anxiety about Venice's future. Some merchants advocated for aggressive pursuit of Atlantic trade. Others argued for maintaining focus on Mediterranean commerce. Still others proposed investing in land-based agriculture. The council could not reach consensus on strategy. Individual families pursued separate ventures. The Republic's institutional framework, which had generated sustained advantage through collective decision-making, could not coordinate response to unprecedented challenges. Historians continue to debate whether Venice could have adapted differently to the Atlantic challenge. The Republic possessed wealth, institutional capacity, and merchant expertise, yet it lacked geographic advantages that Atlantic powers possessed. Venice could not compete with Portuguese and Spanish powers for dominance of Atlantic trade routes. The Republic's best strategy involved maintaining its Mediterranean position while investing in alternative sources of wealth. This is essentially what Venice did. Yet this strategy represented acceptance of diminished international significance. Venice remained wealthy and remained independent, yet it ceased to function as a major player in global commerce. The Republic that had accumulated wealth through innovation and adaptation became a society organized around maintaining inherited position. The institutional framework that had generated sustained advantage became a prison, preventing further adaptation. The paradox of Venice's decline lay in how the Republic's greatest strength became its greatest weakness. The institutional stability that had generated sustained Mediterranean dominance prevented rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. The monopoly system that had created predictable profits prevented competition and innovation. The legal framework that had prevented corruption prevented officials from supporting new ventures. Venice's decline was not caused by external forces overwhelming the Republic, but by internal rigidity preventing adaptation to changing circumstances. Genoa, after Lepanto, confronted a fundamentally altered Mediterranean landscape. The Republic's naval capacity had diminished relative to Venice's. Genoese merchants faced increasing restrictions in Venetian-controlled territories. Trading posts that Genoese families had maintained for centuries became economically marginal. The Republic's merchant class recognized that the era of Genoese Mediterranean dominance had ended. Yet rather than accepting irrelevance, Genoese merchant families pursued a dramatic transformation that would reshape their identity and their relationship to power. The pivot toward banking and finance represented a calculated response to declining maritime commerce. Genoese families possessed accumulated capital from centuries of Mediterranean trade. Rather than investing this wealth in increasingly unprofitable maritime ventures, they redirected it toward financial services. The Spinola family, the Pallavicini family, the Doria family, these merchant dynasties transformed themselves into international bankers. They financed European monarchs, funded military campaigns, and managed international credit networks. This transformation proved remarkably successful in generating wealth. Genoese bankers accumulated fortunes that rivaled or exceeded what traditional Mediterranean merchants could generate. The Spinola family financed Spanish kings and Portuguese explorers. The Pallavicini family managed credit networks extending across Europe. Individual Genoese families became wealthier than they had been as maritime merchants. Yet this financial success represented a fundamental loss of Genoese identity. The republic that had emerged as a unified maritime power gradually dissolved into a collection of wealthy families operating independently from one another. The Doria family, once dominant in Genoese politics, lost influence to rival families. The Spinola family rose to prominence, yet their power remained contested by other families. The Fieschi family pursued their own interests. Individual families negotiated separately with foreign powers, often pursuing contradictory policies. Genoa ceased to function as a coherent political entity. The city itself experienced demographic and economic decline. Genoa's population contracted as merchant families relocated to other European cities, where their banking services were in greater demand. The Spinola family maintained residences in Genoa, yet they spent increasing amounts of time in other European capitals. The Pallavicini family similarly divided their time between Genoa and distant financial centres. The city that had been the centre of Genoese merchant activity became increasingly peripheral to the family's actual business operations. Genoa's loss of Corsica to France in 1768 symbolised the Republic's declining power and relevance. Corsica had represented a crucial strategic possession for centuries. The island provided naval bases, agricultural resources, and strategic position, controlling western Mediterranean routes. Genoa's inability to retain Corsica demonstrated the Republic's reduced military capacity. The state could not defend its possessions against determined foreign pressure. Individual Genoese families lacked the institutional coordination necessary to mobilize collective defense. The sale of Corsica represented more than a military defeat. It represented an acknowledgement that Genoa no longer functioned as a territorial power. The Republic retained nominal sovereignty over the island, yet it could not exercise effective control. France, a rising Atlantic power, simply annexed Corsica. Genoa's merchant families accepted this loss without significant resistance. The family's wealth no longer depended on territorial possessions. They could accumulate wealth through banking and finance regardless of whether Genoa controlled Mediterranean islands. The irony of Genoa's transformation lay in how individual family wealth increased even as collective Genoese power declined. Wealthy Genoese bankers accumulated fortunes exceeding what medieval merchants could have imagined. Yet this wealth did not translate into political power or cultural significance. Individual families operated as international bankers rather than as representatives of a unified Genoese state. Genoa survived as a political entity, yet it ceased to function as a civilization. The Republic's governmental structure reflected this transformation. The Doge, once a powerful political figure, became increasingly ceremonial. The Great Council, designed to coordinate merchant activity, ceased to function as a deliberative body. Individual families negotiated directly with foreign powers rather than coordinating through state institutions. Genoa's government became a hollow shell, maintaining nominal authority, while actual power flowed through individual families' financial networks. Genoese merchant families' investment in banking and finance represented a different kind of adaptation than Venice's shift toward landed wealth. Venice maintained its territorial possessions and its Mediterranean trade, accepting reduced profits rather than abandoning its original character. Genoa abandoned its maritime identity entirely, transforming itself into something fundamentally different. Individual families prospered through this transformation, yet the Republic itself ceased to exist as a meaningful political entity. The education of young Genoese merchants reflected this cultural transformation. Young men from banking families trained in accounting, credit instruments, and international finance rather than in navigation and maritime commerce. They studied the financial practices of European monarchs and learned to manage international credit networks. The skills necessary for Mediterranean commerce became irrelevant. Genoese identity shifted from maritime merchants to international bankers. Genoa's relationship with the Ottoman Empire changed fundamentally during this period. As Genoese merchant families shifted toward banking and finance, they lost interest in maintaining trading posts in Ottoman territories. The Black Sea trade, which had generated substantial wealth for Genoese merchants, became less significant. Individual families pursued financial opportunities in Europe rather than commercial opportunities in the Mediterranean. Genoa's presence in Ottoman territories gradually diminished. The Genoese banking family's success in European finance created new vulnerabilities. These families' wealth depended on the stability of European monarchies and the credit networks connecting them. When European political circumstances shifted, Genoese bankers faced potential losses. The family's fortunes became intertwined with European political conflicts rather than with Mediterranean commerce. This created exposure to risks that Mediterranean merchants could avoid. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars demonstrated the vulnerabilities of Genoa's transformation. As European political order collapsed, the credit networks that had generated Genoese banking wealth became unstable. Individual families faced potential bankruptcy as monarchies they had financed collapsed. The Republic itself, lacking institutional cohesion or military power, could not protect its merchant families' interests. Genoa fell under French control and ceased to function as an independent political entity. The irony of Genoa's decline lay in how the Republic's transformation into a collection of banking families prevented the kind of institutional response that might have preserved its independence. Venice, despite its internal rigidity, maintained institutional structures that allowed coordinated response to external threats. Genoa, having dissolved into individual families pursuing separate interests, could not coordinate any response. When Napoleon conquered Italy, Genoa fell without significant resistance. Yet Genoese banking families survived the Napoleonic Wars more successfully than Venetian merchants. Individual families' wealth, dispersed across multiple European cities and financial networks, proved more resilient than Venice's concentrated wealth in Mediterranean trade and land-based agriculture. After the Napoleonic Wars ended, Genoese banking families resumed their financial operations. Individual families prospered, yet the Republic itself remained subordinate to larger European powers. The contrast between Venice's and Genoa's fates during this period illustrated the consequences of their different transformations. Venice maintained greater political autonomy and greater cultural significance, yet its wealth declined more severely. Genoa's individual families accumulated greater wealth, yet the Republic ceased to function as an independent political entity. Neither city adapted successfully to the Atlantic-centered world order. Both cities maintained significance, yet both ceased to function as major powers in global affairs. Genoa's transformation from maritime republic to collection of banking families represented a different kind of decline than Venice's. Venice declined while maintaining its institutional framework and its territorial possessions. Genoa declined by abandoning its institutional framework and its maritime identity. Individual Genoese families prospered through this transformation, yet the Republic itself effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful political entity. By the 18th century, both Venice and Genoa had transformed from dynamic commercial republics into relics of their former greatness. Venice maintained greater wealth and greater political autonomy than Genoa, yet the Republic functioned primarily as a destination for tourists seeking to witness the remnants of past glory. Genoa had fragmented into a collection of wealthy families operating independently, its political structure reduced to ceremonial functions. Neither city exercised significant influence over Mediterranean affairs. Both had become marginal players in a world increasingly dominated by Atlantic powers. Venice's last doge, Ludovico Manin, abdicated in 1797 as French revolutionary forces approached the city. This moment marked the formal end of the Venetian Republic, which had maintained independence for over 1100 years. The abdication represented not merely a political transition, but a symbolic acknowledgement that Venice could no longer sustain itself as an independent power. The Republic that had accumulated wealth through maritime dominance and maintained that dominance through institutional stability could not adapt to the revolutionary upheaval transforming Europe. Genoa's fate proved even more dramatic. The Republic had already ceased to function as a coherent political entity before French forces arrived. Individual merchant families operated independently, pursuing their own interests without coordinating through state institutions. When Napoleon conquered Italy, Genoa fell without significant resistance. The city briefly became the capital of the Ligurian Republic, a French puppet state. After Napoleon's defeat, Genoa fell under the control of the Kingdom of Piedmont. The republic that had emerged as a unified maritime power effectively ceased to exist as an independent entity. The contrast between Venice's and Genoa's final moments illustrated the consequences of their different institutional trajectories. Venice maintained enough institutional cohesion to function as a recognizable political entity until the very end. The Republic possessed a doge, a great council, and governmental structures that had persisted for centuries. These institutions proved unable to adapt to revolutionary circumstances, yet they maintained their form until external force eliminated them. Genoa, by contrast, had already dissolved into factional divisions before external forces arrived. The Republic's governmental structures had become hollow shells. Individual families pursued their own interests without coordinating through state institutions. The aftermath of Venice's fall demonstrated the Republic's enduring cultural significance. Venice remained wealthy despite its political subordination to foreign powers. The city maintained its artistic and architectural heritage. Visitors traveled to Venice to witness the remnants of Venetian civilization. The Republic's cultural legacy transcended its political fate. Venice became a symbol of past glory, a destination for those seeking to understand the Mediterranean's medieval and early modern history. Genoa's aftermath proved less culturally significant. The city remained economically important as a port, yet it ceased to function as a centre of cultural or political significance. Genoese merchant families dispersed throughout Europe, pursuing financial interests in distant capitals. The city itself became increasingly provincial. Genoa survived as a geographic location, yet it ceased to function as a civilization. The Republic's cultural legacy became fragmented, dispersed among individual families rather than embodied in collective institutions. The Ottoman Empire's continued dominance of Mediterranean territories during this period illustrated how completely Venice and Genoa had lost their former position. The Ottoman Empire, which both cities had competed against, emerged as the Mediterranean's dominant power. Ottoman fleets patrolled Mediterranean waters. Ottoman rulers controlled the most valuable trade routes. The Mediterranean, which had been the centre of European commerce and power for centuries, had become increasingly marginal to global affairs. Both Venice and Genoa, cities that had accumulated wealth through Mediterranean dominance, found themselves economically marginalized in a world increasingly focused on Atlantic commerce. The Napoleonic Wars represented a turning point for both cities. Venice fell under French control and subsequently under Austrian control. The Republic's territorial possessions were divided among various European powers. Genoa briefly became a French puppet state before falling under Piedmontese control. Neither city regained independence after the Napoleonic Wars. Both remained subordinate to larger European powers. The era of independent city-state republics had ended. Venice and Genoa, which had functioned as sovereign powers for centuries, became provincial cities within larger nation-states. Yet Venice maintained greater cultural and economic significance than Genoa after the Napoleonic Wars. The city's artistic and architectural heritage attracted visitors from throughout Europe. Venice became a symbol of romantic beauty and historical grandeur. Merchants and artists travelled to Venice to participate in its cultural life. The city's wealth, though reduced from its medieval and early modern peak, remained substantial. Venice remained a significant Mediterranean port and a centre of cultural significance. Genoa's post-Napoleonic fate proved less favourable. The city remained economically important as a port, yet it lacked Venice's cultural significance. Genoese merchant families, having transformed themselves into international bankers, no longer maintained strong connections to the city itself. Individual families operated from distant European capitals. Genoa became increasingly provincial, a port city lacking the cultural institutions and artistic heritage that made Venice significant. The city survived, yet it ceased to function as a centre of civilization. The rediscovery of Venice's historical significance during the 19th century reflected changing European attitudes toward history and culture. Romantic intellectuals celebrated Venice as a symbol of past glory and lost beauty. Historians studied Venetian institutions and Venetian commercial practices. Artists painted Venetian scenes. Writers composed works celebrating Venice's history. This cultural rediscovery transformed Venice into a symbol of historical significance, transcending its contemporary political importance. Venice became a destination for those seeking to understand European history and civilization. Genoa experienced no comparable cultural rediscovery. The city remained economically significant as a port, yet it lacked the cultural institutions and artistic heritage that attracted European intellectuals to Venice. Genoese history was studied by specialists, yet it did not capture the broader European imagination. Genoa became a footnote in European history rather than a symbol of past glory. The city that had competed with Venice for Mediterranean dominance became increasingly forgotten. The weight of history bore differently on the two cities. Venice carried the weight of its own past glory. The city's artistic and architectural heritage constantly reminded visitors of Venice's former dominance. This weight proved both a burden and an asset. Venice's past glory attracted visitors and scholars, yet it also created pressure to maintain historical authenticity. The city became increasingly focused on preserving its past rather than creating its future. Genoa carried the weight of its own failure. The city's decline from Mediterranean power to provincial port represented a dramatic fall from grace. Yet this fall proved less visible than Venice's because Genoa lacked the artistic and architectural heritage that constantly reminded observers of past glory. Genoa's history became increasingly obscured by the passage of time. The city that had competed with Venice for Mediterranean dominance became increasingly forgotten. The fundamental difference between Venice's and Genoa's historical legacies lay in how their institutional trajectories shaped their cultural significance. Venice's institutional stability created lasting cultural institutions and artistic achievements that transcended the Republic's political fate. The city's museums, libraries, and artistic works preserved Venetian civilization for future generations. Genoa's institutional fragmentation prevented the creation of comparable cultural institutions. Individual families' wealth did not translate into collective cultural achievements that would endure beyond their lifetimes. By the 19th century, Venice and Genoa had become symbols of different historical lessons. Venice represented the consequences of institutional rigidity and the inability to adapt to changing circumstances. The city that had accumulated wealth through innovation and adaptation became a museum of its own past. Genoa represented the consequences of factional division and institutional fragmentation. The city that had competed with Venice for Mediterranean dominance fragmented into individual families pursuing separate interests. Yet both cities maintained significance as historical symbols. Venice represented the grandeur of medieval and early modern civilization. Genoa represented the complexity of Mediterranean history. Both cities attracted historians, artists, and intellectuals seeking to understand European civilization. Both cities maintained economic significance as ports and cultural centers. Neither city regained the political power or international significance they had possessed during their era of Mediterranean dominance. Yet both cities' historical legacies proved more enduring than their political power.